Hello! Welcome, or welcome back to my channel, Musings by Elaine. Today we'll be doing my June wrap-up. So, I read a total of 8 books in June. I started out really strong in the beginning of the month, and then I hit a bit of a reading slump maybe like halfway through where I just wasn't really feeling the reading. But I read a total of 4 young adult books, 1 memoir, and then 2 adult fiction books. So let's get started. So first book that I read was a reread because I was in the mood for something kind of creepy, atmospheric, and that was A Certain Slant of Light by Whitcomb. I was in the mood for a really good ghost story, and this is definitely that. It's technically labeled as a young adult fiction book, but I would put it more as an adult fiction because the main characters are both adults. They're ghosts that end up inhabiting the bodies of teenagers. So it's really interesting. The main character's name is Helen, and she's been dead for maybe, I think, 100 years or something, and probably I'd say around 25 or something when she died. And her death is a little bit of a mystery, but the way that the mythology works in this world is that the ghosts can't see each other when they're dead. They can only see humans, and what Helen does is that she cleaves to a host, which means that she can follow around a human around, and that prevents her from basically falling under and dying, or like experiencing some sort of like torture in the afterworld. So she follows around this high school English teacher, and then none of the humans can sense her presence, and she can walk through walls and stuff, but she can't really move stuff. She's not like a poltergeist or something. One day she is in the classroom and she notices a young teenage boy making eye contact with her. And so that's really interesting because ghosts aren't supposed to be able to be seen by humans. And then when she talks to him, she figures out that he's actually another ghost named James who is inhabiting the body of this teenage boy. And so what happens is that the rest of the book is all about her and James falling in love with each other, and then like having to deal with figuring out maybe how they died, and also maybe some more dark forces out there that they can't understand and control, and then also the dark forces that live within humans themselves. I think this book does a really good job of portraying the loneliness and sorrow that is inherent in someone who has been alone for decades by themselves, and it's really realistic in that sense, and I really found the love story very touching, heartwarming, and almost profound in a way. I would recommend it. And the cover is really creepy, but like when you read it, it kind of evokes like the sense you get from it. I wouldn't call this specifically a horror book because it's really more heart-touching than not. So the second book that I read was Wilder Girls by Rory. This tells the story of a post-apocalyptic world, and it's almost entirely contained in this single island where there's an all-girls boarding school. There is something called the Tartt, which affects every single girl differently. It's sort of like a virus or like a plague that for one girl may cause them to like lose their eye, another girl causes their hand to become all silvery. It's almost like an autoimmune disease from what I can understand. Like the girls go under seizures and like they start bleeding and their bones start breaking. It's very brutal. And not only does this tox affect humans, but it also affects all the animals and the plants on the island. And from what I can understand, it's like a strange mutation of their genetics. This book had an emphasis on character development, and for me, less on plot. I mean, there's this mystery of what the tox is and how it came to be, but there seems to be more of an emphasis on a Lord of the Flies kind of plot, but with girls. And there's definitely more character development between the main protagonist and then the 2 lesser protagonists. Mystery, I really wanted to know more about the mystery of the Tartt, and for me, that wasn't entirely satisfied by the ending. I feel like the ending is very open and ambiguous, but this book wasn't a love or a hate book for me. It was kind of just like a in-the-middle book. It was 3 stars for me, but I think that this book had a really great, compelling sapphic story, and it was very complex and strong. But since I'm a plot girl and the plot wasn't enough for me, this wasn't something I particularly enjoyed. But the horror is so greatly evoked in this story that if you're into that, then then this is definitely a book that would be up your alley. So the third book that I read was The Secret History by Donna Tartt. Now, if you want to hear my unfiltered thoughts on this, you can check out this video that I did about it. I gave this book a 5 out of 5 stars. This book wouldn't really be for everyone. It's very dense with references, and it's almost elitist in the way it describes and upholds the world of academia. But it's definitely a great mystery book, and it's a great book looking at the motivations of different characters and how murder affects each and every one of them. So the next book that I picked up was Educated by Tara Westover. It's actually a memoir, it's not quite a book. This was a very gripping story for me to read. It's really disarming to read memoirs or nonfiction and to realize that everything that has happened in these is real, and not necessarily a work of fiction like with regular books. So it's weird to think about these characters and knowing that they're actual people, because with real life you can analyze characters' motivations and stuff, but when it comes to nonfiction or memoirs, these are people that are actually real. So because they're real and their motivations can be more complex than even maybe the author or the memoirist, I don't know what the word is, but the person that's writing the story, they might not even necessarily know why a person does this thing. So I really thought this book was great. It's very harrowing, and there are some very intense scenes of abuse, so just trigger warning for that. It was kind of a dark book at many times, and it was really hard to get through because I don't normally read books with such depictions of abuse, but because I think this book has great thoughts about how the education does work in real life and the power that learning can do to the brain, to the mind, and to the soul. So I think it's really interesting because education can affect people in many different ways. And for many people, education is kind of like a given, but for Tara Westover, it wasn't necessarily a given. She was never properly educated, and yet she was able to achieve such strides in her life. And how much education both changed her, but also made her realize who she was. Also, in light of everything that's happened, I think education really, in any topic, really teaches us to think beyond ourselves and to really empathize with other people. So the next book that I read was Pachinko by Min Jin Lee. This is a sweeping, multi-generational epic story about the Japanese imperialism of Korea during World War II, and then the subsequent consequences of the war ending, and then ethnic Koreans still being discriminated against in Japan. It's very eye-opening, and it's a topic that I never necessarily even thought to think about before, because it wasn't something that was taught when I learned about World War II, because I learned from a very America-centric version of World War II. So it really was good for me to read this and maybe understand a little bit more of the global nature of this World War, and also about the universality of discrimination, and the fact that what was heartbreaking was that these ethnic Koreans have been in Japan for many generations and they were still seen as not Japanese. They had to deal with wrongful prejudice and discrimination, much like how immigrants here in America have to deal with that. Some of the characters broke my heart, especially Sunja and Isaac, but also their son Noah. Others made me angry, like Hansu, but near the end, I thought overall this was a really great story, and it did a really good job with the beginning characters, but then I think near the end, the narrative suffered a little bit because the author tried to introduce way too many characters and way too many backstories, and then it kind of ended up stifling the narrative instead of embracing it. But I think the author said that in an interview, she said that she really talked with and interviewed some ethnic Koreans, and many of her characters are composites of that. I think maybe she wanted to include all of the stories that she was able to talk to, and she maybe lost a little bit more of the magic that she had at the beginning of the novel in the end, but it's still a really good book to read, and I would highly recommend it. So the next book that I read was The Queen of Attolia by Megan Whalen Turner. This was another reread for me because this is honestly a comfort series to me, and I have gotten a friend of mine to start reading the Queen's Thief series, so I wanted to kind of read it with her in solidarity, only I was only able to get my hands on this second book. there are 5 books out now and there's a 6th coming out. This is a fantastic fantasy series and I can't really recommend it enough. The last book I read was another reread for me, and it's Before I Fall by Lord Oliver. This is quite nostalgic for me because I think I read this before I was in high school and then again when I was in high school, and now that I'm several years out of high school, reading it again made me remember what it was like as a teenager, how fragile and insecure you can feel, and how much being a part of something is so important to your own identity, how much in your own world that you are as a teenager that you don't often think of what your words and actions can do to affect another person's life. This book does a great job on topics of popularity, bullying, and then just the general feeling of being a teenager. You think you're going to live forever, but you don't always necessarily do. A brief synopsis, this talks about the main character, Samantha Kingston. She's seen as a popular, perfect girl in high school, and one day she goes to a party and she gets into a car accident and then she dies. And then she wakes up and it's the same day over and over again. It's kind of like Groundhog Day, but in teenagers' eyes. I think this book really masterfully touches upon topics of death, bullying, suicide, and popularity. It can be a very heavy book, so I just think about those trigger warnings before you get into it. But it's honestly actually a very profound book, and it has one of the best character arcs in realistic fiction that I've seen, because when you start out, you really don't really like the main character, but by the end of the book, I found myself seeing the redeemable qualities in her, and then also understanding that maybe as a teenager you don't really necessarily know everything there is to know about life, and it's okay to make mistakes as long as you realize and grow from those mistakes. So yeah, and that was all the books that I read in June. Sorry that this is so late. I kind of was procrastinating this video, but hopefully I'll have more videos coming. Alright, see you next time!